It was a bright sunny day in Chicago, Illinois. Children were walking to the park with their parents. Toddlers were clapping in their strollers. Teenagers were zooming down the streets on their skateboards. Couples were busy shopping together from store to store. And a few elderly people sat on their porches enjoying a fresh glass of lemonade. This particular street in Chicago was always a little busy because of all the small shops and local vendors that were located there. Restaurant workers and small business owners were out on the street handing out flyers, advertising their new products, and sample bites of their new dishes. Dean Schaefer was taking his usual walk around the neighborhood. As he read some of the flyers he was handed, Dean walked towards the smoothie stand. Dean usually bought a cool, refreshing smoothie on his way to the park, about 20 minutes away. He sat down and gathered up his energy there before returning back home. Dean could see the smoothie vendor up ahead, but today there seemed to be a different smoothie guy. What happened to the young lady who used to work here before? Oh, you mean Nancy? She's out of town. I'll be running the smoothie stand until she returns. What would you like? My usual watermelon kiwi. I was actually giving out free samples of some new flavors. Here, why don't you give this one a try, while I make you your smoothie? Sure, thank you. This was nice. Maybe I'll order this next time I'm here. The young man put a straw in Dean's smoothie and handed it to him. Have a nice day. You too. Dean walked down the road. It was half an hour later that he returned to his apartment. Dean was in his late 30s. He was single and lived by himself. Life was pretty much settled for Dean. He saved up some money over the years doing this and that, and managed with his daily expenses. Dean went around the apartment and tidied up his belongings. He made dinner and went to bed, just like every other day. The rest of the week went by pretty much the same. Until one morning, Dean heard a loud knock on his door. Dean rarely had any visitors over. He was a bit surprised when he heard the bell ringing continuously. He opened the door and saw Officer Pete from BIIPD. Officer Pete, how are you? What brings you here? Were you able to find the man who ran away the other day? 911, what's your emergency? There's a fight outside of the apartment building here. In the alley, there's a man that has been hurt. The police need to arrive here as soon as possible. What's the address? In the neighborhood of Bridgeport in Chicago, the local police received numerous calls from apartment residents from the east side. They all complained of a brawl that was going on outside the building that seemed to be getting out of hand. The dispatchers immediately sent their first responders to the scene. They stepped around a quiet alleyway between two buildings of an apartment complex. By the time they reached there, the fight was long over with. But luckily enough, the police got their hands on the culprit. A middle-aged man named Dean Schaefer. But Dean Schaefer wasn't charged with any crime, as he and the others who witnessed the event all testified that Schaefer only acted out of defense. The police went out in search of the victim, but unfortunately, they couldn't locate him. Locals in the area said that the man deserved what he got, and praised Dean for being courageous and defending himself even after he had received a few cuts and bruises in the process. Apparently, the victim who had fled from the scene after the incident was a mugger, who had been stealing from people in the neighboring area for some time now. Some of the locals demanded that he be found and arrested. The police collected samples from the crime scene and entered Dean's pocket knife with which he defended himself from the mugger into the evidence. That was one of the concrete evidence from which the police could potentially identify the runaway thief. All evidence collected was sent to the forensic laboratory for testing and analysis. and about a week later, the results were in the hands of the police. The police were shocked to see something that they didn't expect. The DNA samples found on Dean's knife matched the blood found from a brutal crime that happened 19 years ago, in which the culprit, Mike Brandt, took the life of a young woman named Gertrude Koenig and had escaped. It was nearly 2 decades later that the police reopened the old case of Gertrude Koenig. It was on a dark, stormy night when a young woman named Gertrude Koenig was heard screaming out for help. Unfortunately, no one paid heed to the young woman's cries until it was too late. Near dawn, the neighbors became suspicious and called the police. When the police arrived, they found the house in a terrible state. When they entered the kitchen, they were horrified to see the cabinets all splattered on and stained red. The utensils and glassware were strewn all over the place. And right in the middle of the gruesome scene, Gertrude Koenig was on the floor in a horrible condition. The police immediately sealed off the property for investigation and contacted the forensic department to make their way to the crime scene. After numerous searches for clues and tests done on samples found in the kitchen, reports indicated the crime had been committed by a man named Mike Brandt. Mike Brandt had supposedly been living with Gertrude Koenig for the past few months. Neighboring locals assumed they must have been in a relationship. They all spoke of how tragic the incident was. They mourned for Gertrude Koenig, saying she was a kind, loving young woman. The police went out on a hunt in search for Mike Brandt, who had fled from the neighborhood. All efforts were in vain until a month later Mike Brandt had been caught breaking into a home in another neighborhood while the owners were away. However, by the time the police arrived on scene, Mike Brandt had escaped once again. The prime suspect behind the case couldn't be found again after that. When months had gone by and the police could not get their hands on any other information, they kept the case aside. It seemed that the culprit behind the murder of Gertrude Koenig was destined to remain unsolved forever. After so long, the police had come close to finding a long-wanted criminal, Mike Brandt. But there was one fact that the police found more puzzling from the samples collected from the crime scene. The DNA of the other individual was identified as a Larry Kimball, whereas they had expected to find the DNA of Mr. Dean Schaefer. When they looked into the matter further, the police were shocked to find out that Dean Schaefer wasn't who he claimed to be. Dean Schaefer was Mike Brandt. One of BIIPD's finest officers, Officer Flynn James, was assigned the case. Officer Flynn James spent days searching the local area. He conveniently found where Dean Schaefer lived. Officer Flynn kept a good eye on Dean Schaefer, and before long, he was able to note down his daily routine. Dean always took an afternoon walk to the park, and on his way, he stopped by a smoothie stand every day. "Sure, thank you. This was nice. Maybe I'll order this next time I'm here." "Mister, you don't have to worry about that. I have a bin here. You can throw out the plastic cup. I usually take all these out to the recycle at the end of the day. Here's your watermelon kiwi smoothie. Have a nice day." "You too." There was one thing the police still had to do to confirm that the culprit who had gotten away 19 years ago, Mike Brandt, was indeed the present Dean Schaefer. They had to get their hands on the DNA of Dean Schaefer once again. Officer Flynn James had intentionally asked for Dean's cup. The cup was sent to the laboratory where up-to-date DNA samples were extracted from it. The DNA found on the cup was an exact match to the DNA of Mike Brandt. "Officer Pete, how are you? What brings you here? Were you able to find the man who ran away the other day?" "Yes, Schaefer. Yes, we have. Turns out we had been looking for the person for a long time now. We just didn't recognize him at first. As a matter of fact, perhaps you also know him, Mr. Dean Schaefer, or should I say, Mr. Mike Brandt? You're under arrest for taking the life of Gertrude Koenig. As soon as Mike Brandt realized he was caught, he pushed the officer and tried to make a run for it. Officer Pete shook his head. He knew Mike Brandt wasn't going to get away again this time. Police were waiting for him downstairs. Mike Brandt was finally arrested and taken into custody. Why did you do this? What was the motive behind taking the life of Gertrude Koenig? I was going through a tough time in my life. I was unemployed. I had no money. I was young, only about 20 back then. I met Gertrude when I was in college, before I dropped out. When I realized that Gertrude was into me, I took advantage of her and started dating her. But it was just a way to use her. She was nothing but a debit card for me. Gertrude belonged to a wealthy family. She lived on her own and her parents sent her money every month. It was one night when she caught me stealing from her. She humiliated me and insulted me. She threatened that she would call the police and hand me over. Things got out of hand that night. I became enraged, and I took her life. Well, Mr. Mike Brandt, how long did you think you would get away with committing such a heinous crime? As long as I and my fellow officers here at BIIPD fight for justice, criminals like you will never get away. Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel. And don't forget to press the bell icon because you know it's interesting.